This is part one of a two-part lecture on the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system in the body that has a unique function in controlling regulation of certain body functions. It includes a group of endocrine glands. Endocrine glands are glands that are what are called ductless. What does that mean? That means they do not secrete to a surface like a sweat gland would. They actually release their chemical substance into the bloodstream, and then that bloodstream carries the chemical hormone to a specific target organ where it has a specific effect. They are similar to glands called paracrine and autocrine glands. We'll talk a little bit about those later. Again, these are to be compared with exocrine glands, which are ducted glands that secrete something onto a surface. This is an example of an endocrine gland. This is the thyroid gland that produces thyroid hormone, and it secretes that thyroid hormone into the capillaries, which then carries that thyroid hormone to the body's cells, where cells that have receptors for that hormone can respond in a specific way. That's opposed to an exocrine gland. For example, here's a sweat gland in a section of the skin that basically produces a chemical substance also that's called sweat, but it secretes it through a duct onto a surface. So exocrine glands secrete from a duct onto a surface. Endocrine glands secrete into the bloodstream hormones which react with a target organ. The endocrine system works very closely with the nervous system. There are a lot of similarities. The nervous system basically consists of neurons, which sometimes will have very long axons that release neurotransmitters to stimulate specific cells. Endocrine glands release hormones into the bloodstream that also respond, that also send that message to specific cells. This is a diagram showing how a neuron works. This would be a motor neuron, which basically begins an action potential that goes down the axon, releasing neurotransmitter, in this case acetylcholine, which is going to stimulate these skeletal muscle fibers to contract. This is an example of a hormone. This hormone, the endocrine gland secretes these hormone molecules into the bloodstream, which float through the bloodstream, and they react with specific target cells that have receptors for that hormone. If the cells do not have receptors for that hormone, they do not react to it. There are many different endocrine organs in the body. We are going to be talking about them one by one. In this part one, we will talk primarily about how endocrine organs work, how hormones work, and we will talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We will cover the rest of these in the second part of this lecture. There are two different classifications of hormones, and they work differently. The first are steroid or steroid-like hormones. They have a typical 4-carbon ring associated with steroids. These are hormones such as the sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. And they're also hormones that are produced in a region of the adrenal gland called the adrenal cortex that we'll talk about in the second hour. We've already mentioned aldosterone when we talked about the urinary system. It is produced in the adrenal cortex. Another hormone, cortisol, is produced in the adrenal cortex that we will talk about in the next hour. So the steroid hormones are one group. The non-steroid hormones are the other group, and they consist of several different types of compounds. Amines are very simple compounds based on a variation of an amino acid, likely usually tyrosine. This is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Then there are protein-based hormones. The initials used here, PTH is parathyroid hormone, GH is growth hormone, PRO is prolactin, and then insulin and glucagon are examples of protein hormones. Peptide hormones are small fragments of amino acids strung together, but not folded into a unique three-dimensional shape like proteins. And the examples of those, antidiuretic hormone of ADH that we've talked about, oxytocin that we've talked about, TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, SS, somatostatin, and GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then there are several hormones that are called glycoproteins, which means they consist of a protein core, but they also have carbohydrate molecules attached to them. And those examples are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. This is an example of what these types of hormones look like. This is a steroid hormone. This hormone is cortisol. It's produced by the adrenal cortex. And you can see the 4-carbon ring associated with the steroids and then these associated groups. Do not memorize what it looks like. Just be aware that this is a steroid hormone. Norepinephrine is an example of an amine, and you can see it has a 1-carbon ring and it has an amine group attached here. This is an example of a protein hormone. This is parathyroid hormone, and it has a unique order of amino acids. These are all amino acids strung together, but not only are they strung together, but they are folded into a unique three-dimensional shape that gives parathyroid hormone its function. Oxytocin is an example of a peptide hormone. This is a small collection of amino acids, in this case 9 amino acids, very simple molecule, but a very important molecule, and we'll talk about it in the next hour. And then prostaglandin is not a steroid hormone. This is an example of a paracrine secretion that we'll talk about in a few minutes. It is a derivative of actually the phospholipid in the cell membrane, and we'll talk more about prostaglandins in a few minutes. So this is an example of the major hormones that we're going to talk about. This is the glands that they are found in. This is the name of the hormone and its abbreviation, and then a little example of either what it does or another name for it. This is another diagram showing the different types of hormones, keeping in mind, as we'll talk about in a minute, the steroid hormones are different in their action on target organs than all of the other ones. That is because steroid hormones, being lipid soluble, can dissolve their way through the cell membrane. So if we look at this chart over here, this is a cell membrane here with its phospholipid bilayer. This is its nucleus with its DNA. And this is a steroid hormone. And this steroid hormone, because it's lipid soluble, can dissolve right through the cell membrane, where it enters the nucleus of the cell and ultimately directly affects the DNA of that cell, causing the production of a messenger RNA molecule, which then goes out into the cytoplasm, is read by the ribosomes, which is what ribosomes do, and they produce a protein molecule. So steroid hormones work by dissolving into the cells and actually working in the nucleus of the cell to produce proteins by the production of specific messenger RNA molecules. An example of that, aldosterone. We remember this chart from when we talked about the renin-angiotensin system, and we said that when your blood pressure is low, renin is produced by the kidney, which activates angiotensin 1, which then is activated into angiotensin 2, which does many things, and one of the things we said it does is angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone. It's released by the adrenal cortex, and it floats through the bloodstream until it gets back to the kidney, where it binds to cells on the distal tubule of the kidney, the distal convoluted tubule, and it increases the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium through the kidney tubules. This is what aldosterone looks like. Again, the typical steroid ring with the associated groups that make this aldosterone. At the level of the distal tubule, this is what happens. This is a cell on the distal tubule. This is the fluid going through the distal tubule. This is the capillaries, the peritubular capillaries, next to the distal tubule. And they basically, when aldosterone is released, it leaves those capillaries, and since it can go right through the cell membrane, it enters the cell of the distal tubule where it binds to a receptor protein that was made by that cell. And then that receptor protein and that aldosterone goes into the nucleus, which causes the production of specific proteins that allows for insertion of new transport channels in the membrane of that distal tubular cell that reabsorbs sodium in exchange for potassium. So whenever sodium comes in, a potassium goes out. And those sodiums are driven in by the sodium-potassium pump, which all cells have on this end, so that as the sodiums are pumped out here and the potassiums are pumped in, they're exchanged here, so that what shows up in the urine is less sodium, more potassium, and as the sodium is reabsorbed into the capillary, water follows it. So the net effect of aldosterone is for reabsorption of sodium into the blood from the distal tubule, water being reabsorbed, which is why you went through this because of low blood pressure, low blood volumes, and excess potassium secreted in the urine, because the potassium stays here and heads on its way down to the collecting duct. That's an example of a steroid hormone. This is an example of a steroid hormone that works pretty much in one spot. In other words, when your adrenal cortex makes aldosterone, it floats through the bloodstream, goes through the whole body, but the only place it really has these receptor proteins is in the distal tubular cells, because the other cells of your body don't have these, so the aldosterone has no effect on those cells. This is one of the ways in which your body can control which cells respond to a specific hormone and which cells do not. Brain cells, liver cells, bone cells don't have this protein. They don't make it, so aldosterone has no effect on them. It only has effect on cells that have this receptor, which are only the cells of the distal tubule. So aldosterone is an example of a hormone that works in a very small targeted area. But there's other types of steroid hormones that have receptors in many different parts of the body. For example, testosterone. When testosterone is secreted from the interstitial cells of Leydig in the testes, that testosterone affects many, many different parts of the body. It has effects on the brain, it has effects on the muscle, it has receptors in the kidneys, the bone marrow, the liver, the sexual organs, and the skin. So some hormones affect many different parts of the body because they have receptors in many different parts of the body. Other hormones have receptors in very limited parts of the body, and so they only affect a small region of the body. The non-steroid hormones, which ones are these? Well, these are all the ones we talked about over here. The amines, the peptides, the proteins, and the glycoproteins. All this group together are molecules that cannot get into the cell, which means that if this is a cell here with its phospholipid bilayer membrane, and this is a hormone outside that cell, unlike the steroids, which can dissolve right through the cell membrane, the non-steroid hormones cannot, which means for them to have an effect, they have to bind to a specific receptor protein in the cell membrane of that cell. Where do those proteins come from? The cell made them and stuck them in the membrane. So if you are a cell that needs to respond to a specific hormone, your DNA of your cell is going to make those proteins and stick them in the membrane. And then they sit there until the hormone is produced. And when the hormone is produced, it binds to the receptor. And since it binds to when it binds to the receptor on the outside of the cell, it causes a conformational change inside the cell, activating a protein in most cases, or in many cases, called adenylate cyclase associated with the receptor protein, that basically takes ATP molecules that the cell has made and cleaves them into another substance called cyclic AMP, or CAMP. And CAMP is what's called a second messenger. In other words, the message arrived here from the hormone, but it can't get into the cell. So it binds to the receptor, and because of this process, this is produced, which acts as a second messenger to tell the cell, hey, this hormone bound, which causes the activation of various proteins in the cell and ultimately a response to that non-steroid hormone. So non-steroid hormones can't get into the cell. They bind to receptor protein on the cell membrane, activating a second messenger inside the cell, cytoplasm, most or many times cyclic AMP, which then acts as a second messenger to cause some type of a response from that cell. Here's an example. Epinephrine is an amine that is released in response to sympathetic stimulation. You're being chased by a tiger, and as we'll talk about in the next hour, your adrenal medulla, the center of your adrenal gland, is going to produce epinephrine. And it's going to float through the bloodstream, and it's going to bind to cells that have epinephrine receptors on the cell membrane. Here's the cell membrane here. This is outside the cell. This is inside the cell. And this is the receptor here. And when epinephrine binds to that, it activates the second messenger, cyclic AMP, which causes many different changes in that cell. For example, if this is a liver cell, and this is epinephrine binds this receptor, it's going to activate proteins that are going to do two things. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to inhibit the production of glycogen. What is the production of glycogen? Glycogen is that storage compound that stores excess carbohydrates. You're being chased by a tiger. You don't need to be storing more glucose molecules. You need to be releasing glucose molecules to have more energy. So it's going to inhibit the synthesis or production of glycogen, and it's going to promote glycogen being broken down that's there into glucose molecules, which will then leave the cell, going out into the bloodstream, providing extra fuel for your body's cells as you're trying to get away from the tiger, which is why when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, your blood glucose level goes up. So epinephrine is an example of a non-steroid hormone that has to bind to the surface of a cell, activating a second messenger, which then produces a response. Insulin is another example. Insulin is a protein hormone. It actually consists of two chains hooked together, has a kind of complex formula, but basically insulin is produced by the pancreas in response to elevated blood glucose levels. When the blood glucose level starts to go up, insulin is produced. When insulin is produced and floats into the bloodstream, it binds to receptors on cells that have insulin receptors. This is a cell membrane here. This is an insulin receptor. This is an insulin molecule. So the insulin molecule binds to this receptor, activating second messengers of several different types, causing many different effects in these cells. One effect is for the taking of vesicles that the cell has made that have transport proteins in them and inserting them in the membrane. These transport proteins are called GLUT4 proteins. They actually allow glucose to enter the cell. So if these are not there, then glucose from outside the cell can't get in. But in the presence of insulin, these are inserted into the membrane. Glucose, which is high in concentration outside the cell, which is why you made the insulin, then is transported by facilitated diffusion through those channels into the cell so that the blood glucose level and the glucose level outside the cell goes down. This is how insulin decreases your blood glucose, by driving glucose into cells through the insertion of these proteins in the cells when insulin binds to the receptor molecule. Another example of a non-steroid hormone response at the cellular level. This is another example of the same thing. This actually shows, here's a cell membrane here. This is outside the cell. This is inside the cell. This is one of those vesicles with those GLUT4 proteins in it. And they sit there until insulin is present. And if your glucose level is low, there's no insulin produced, so these stay like this. But all of a sudden, when your glucose level goes up, your pancreas makes insulin. Insulin binds to this receptor here, which inserts these vesicles into the cell membrane. And when these vesicles with these protein channels are inserted into the membrane, these GLUT4 proteins, glucose, which is outside the cell, can then come into the cell, lowering the glucose outside the cell, lowering the blood glucose level, and allowing that cell to utilize that glucose to either store or make energy. Third example of a non-steroid hormone action. We've already talked about antidiuretic hormone. We said that the collecting duct of the kidney passes down through the renal medulla on its way to the minor calyx. And we said that because of the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, you have a high osmotic pressure outside here, which means water that's in this distal tubule, this collecting duct, wants to leave, and it can only in the presence of antidiuretic hormone. So if antidiuretic hormone is not present, then the cells of the collecting duct are not permeable to water, and you secrete or excrete a urine that's very dilute, very high in volume. But if you're dehydrated, if you've been asleep all night long, hadn't drank anything, what happens is your posterior pituitary gland is going to say, hey, we got to conserve water. It's going to produce antidiuretic hormone, which is going to allow those cells of the collecting duct to be permeable to water. So water is going to go the way it wants to go. It's going to come out into this hypertonic environment, and you're going to produce a urine that's very concentrated, very low in volume. How does that happen? Well, this is basically antidiuretic hormone that's produced, and it's delivered via the vasa recta and the peritubular capillaries, and it binds to receptors on the collecting duct cells. And when it binds to those receptors, it activates the second messenger, which is cyclic AMP, which basically inserts vesicles that have channel proteins called aquaporins into the membrane. Aquaporins are channels that allow water to get through, and if antidiuretic hormone is present, these are inserted into the membrane. Water enters the cell, it is then pumped out into the bloodstream, you retain water, and what's left in the collecting duct is a very concentrated, low volume of urine. Another example of a non-steroid hormone acting on a target cell. We're going to switch gears for a minute and talk about prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are not hormones, but they are like hormones. They're paracrine substances. They are substances that are produced and act locally. In other words, they'll be produced and act in a very small area near where they're produced. They are very potent, and they are only made when they're needed, and then they're rapidly inactivated. What do? Well, they have several different functions that we'll talk about, but one of the things they do is they can actually alter the response of the body to hormones by inhibiting or activating the enzyme adenylate cyclase, which cleaves the ATP and forms the second messenger cyclic AMP in cells. Many, many different effects of prostaglandins, including they can vasodilate, dilate blood vessels. They inhibit hydrochloric acid production in the stomach. They also are responsible for smooth muscle contraction, primarily in the uterus. They produce fevers. They also can increase the platelet deposition of in the effect of a broken blood vessel. There are many different prostaglandins. You do not have to memorize them all, but this kind of gives an idea of kind of the things that they do and where they work. Prostaglandins work throughout the body, but again, they work locally. They can work on the airways. They are associated in some of them with bronchoconstriction, some of them with bronchodilation. In other words, they can constrict airways. They can also dilate airways. They are protective of the stomach lining, which means that the presence of prostaglandins protects the stomach from damage due to the hydrochloric acid. They also increase your sensitivity to pain or your sense of pain. They also are responsible for the development of fever. They're also responsible for increased uterine contractions, including the contractions associated with menstrual cramping. They also are associated with increased platelet plug formation, and in some cases vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So they have many, many different effects. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because there's several commonly used medications that affect prostaglandins. We said prostaglandins are substances that are produced from the phospholipid bilayer of cell membranes, and they're produced in a two-step process. The first step, taking the phospholipids and converting them to a substance called arachidonic acid, and then the second one producing the prostaglandins themselves. We won't talk about the leukotrienes today. And these are the different prostaglandins that we talked about. What difference does it make? Well, it makes difference because substances like corticosteroids, prednisone and the like, block this stage. So that means they block prostaglandin formation. They also block leukotriene formation. The classes of drugs, aspirins, the nonsteroidals, Advil, Motrin, Nuprin, all of those block this pathway, which means, again, you have decreased prostaglandin production. Why would you want that? Well, if you're having, for example, increased fever from prostaglandins, they bring down fever. That's why you take Advil or Motrin for your fever. You're having increased menstrual cramping, you'll take nonsteroidal medications for that. The problem is that they also, since they increase platelet aggregation, if you block them, you will have increased activity with bleeding. You will have decreased production of the stomach lining, which is why chronic use of those medications can cause ulcers and problems with heartburn and things like that, as well as increased problems with your airways. You can have decreased activity of your peristalsis in your GI tract and so forth. Okay, we're going to move down to what controls hormonal secretions, and primarily hormone secretions are controlled, like most of the body's regulatory processes, by a process of negative feedback. Hormones are regulated very precisely by negative feedback. They are also regulated by the presence or absence of what are called tropic hormones. A tropic hormone is a hormone that causes the release of another hormone. And we will learn about, for example, we will learn a tropic hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone being produced from the anterior pituitary gland that then targets the thyroid gland that causes the release of thyroid hormone. So a tropic hormone is a hormone that causes the release of another hormone. Alterations of the internal environment can cause release of hormones. For example, the pancreas responds to elevated blood glucose by releasing insulin, lower blood glucose by releasing glucagon. We'll talk about that next hour. Nervous system stimulation. We will talk about the adrenal medulla being part of the sympathetic nervous system, so that when the adrenal medulla is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine and norepinephrine are released. We're going to finish today talking about the pituitary gland in this part 1. The pituitary gland is the first hormone endocrine gland we're going to talk about, and it is found in association with an area just superior to it called the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is a small glandular structure that sits in that region of the brain cavity called the sella turcica. It consists of 2 parts, an anterior pituitary gland, or adenohypophysis, and a posterior pituitary gland, or a neurohypophysis. These 2 sit next to one another, but they actually originate from different tissues. They both produce hormones. They both secrete hormone. They both release hormones, but they don't both produce hormones. The anterior pituitary gland releases hormones that it produces. The posterior pituitary gland releases hormones, but those hormones are not produced in the posterior pituitary gland, but produced in the hypothalamus and transported down into the posterior pituitary gland. This is a close-up showing the relationship between, here's the thalamus, the hypothalamus here, and then this is what they call the infundibular stalk that has basically blood vessels and processes from cells in the hypothalamus. Those processes are going to go to the posterior pituitary gland. The blood vessels are going to supply both of these, and they're going to take releasing factors to the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate them. Again, hormone release from those glands. The anterior pituitary gland releases its hormones that it produces itself into the bloodstream, into the capillaries. The posterior pituitary gland also releases hormones, but those are not made in the posterior pituitary gland. They are actually made in the hypothalamus and transported down through that infundibular stalk and then released, very similar to neurotransmitters, but into the bloodstream. So both of these glands do secrete hormones into the bloodstream, but the anterior pituitary gland hormones are made down here and released. The posterior pituitary glands are actually made up in the hypothalamus. As far as the anterior pituitary gland, it does produce 6 different hormones we're going to talk about, but it only releases those in response to releasing hormones or tropic hormones that are delivered to it down the blood vessels from the hypothalamus. So even though the hypothalamus doesn't make the anterior pituitary hormones, it stimulates their release by the process of producing releasing hormones that then stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce their hormones. As those hormones are produced, they feed back as a negative feedback to turn the hypothalamus off, so that you don't get oversecretion of those hormones from those glands. This is a diagram that has an overview of the anterior pituitary gland hormones, and they are shown here. They are growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. We've covered these before. We'll talk about them again. All of these hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland are only released under direction of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. So these are hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus that are sent down through the blood vessels to the anterior pituitary gland through the stalk that then cause the release of these hormones. Growth hormone is stimulated, its release, by a hormone from the hypothalamus called growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone is inhibited in the anteropituitary gland by a hormone produced by the hypothalamus called somatostatin. Prolactin, and we'll talk about what prolactin does in a minute, is stimulated by a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called prolactin releasing factor, and it's inhibited by what's called prolactin release inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus, which is also the chemical substance dopamine. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary gland under direction from thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So when the hypothalamus makes this, it sends it down the blood vessels to the anterior pituitary gland, which stimulates cells of the anterior pituitary gland to secrete this into the bloodstream. Corticotropin stimulating hormone, releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. That is a tropic hormone that affects the adrenal cortex. So its action is going to be on the cortex of the adrenal gland. It's going to cause the release of a substance, cortisol. And then the last releasing hormone causes the release of two hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then causes the release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland and follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Remember that follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the production of the ovarian follicle in the female. It stimulates spermatogenesis in the male. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation in the female, and it is also called interstitial cell stimulating hormone, or causes the production of testosterone from the interstitial cells of Leydig in the male. So each of these anterior pituitary hormones are released under the direction of releasing hormones which are produced in the hypothalamus. And then they have specific effects on specific target organs. We're going to talk about those now briefly. Growth hormone. Growth hormone is also called somatotropin, and it does what you think it does. It increases the cell growth, it increases mitosis, it increases protein synthesis, it increases the breakdown of lipids so you can make more things. It increases amino acids movement into cells so you can make more proteins. All of the things that are associated with growth are under the direction of growth hormone. It's usually secreted in pulses. It's not secreted constantly, and most of the time secretion is at night as opposed to in the daytime. Growth hormone levels are highest when you're youngest, and then as you grow, they decrease as you get older, so that if you live long enough, your growth hormone levels will essentially go down to zero and you will do no more growing. But you can see your growth hormone levels are highest when you're doing your most growing during your younger years before puberty, and when you're fully grown, your growth hormone levels drop significantly. Growth hormone can be found in abnormal amounts. For example, what's called pituitary giantism. This is when babies are born with abnormally high amounts of growth hormone, and so therefore those individuals are physiologically relatively the same as other than the fact that everything is larger. They're much taller, all of their bones, but proportionally everything is the same. Likewise, if babies are born with low growth hormone levels, it can lead to what's called pituitary dwarfism. Again, proportionally, all the body parts are in the same ratio. It's just everything is smaller. Occasionally, after someone is fully grown and they're an adult, their growth plates have closed, so they can't grow any taller, but those people occasionally will have increased amounts of growth hormone later in life, and when that occurs, you end up with a condition called acromegaly, whereas you can't grow any taller because your growth plates have closed. Your bones can get thicker and more rugged looking appearing. This is an example of an individual as he aged. with acromegaly. You can see the pronounced features that you see as the bones get thicker. This person can't grow any taller, but their bones can become more prominent, and these are very classic findings of abnormal growth hormone after puberty has occurred. So that's growth hormone. It affects primarily many different cells of the body. Another hormone produced by the anterior pituitary gland is prolactin. Pro means for, lactin means milk. Prolactin levels generally are low until a woman is in the around middle part of a pregnancy, in which prolactin levels will start to increase. Why do they increase? Because prolactin releasing factor starts to go up. And when that happens, the breast starts to develop, the glands start to develop milk. Now, the breasts themselves develop as a secondary female sex characteristic at puberty because of estrogen. So the actual development of the breast is a secondary sex characteristic, but the production of milk is under the direction of prolactin, which only occurs normally in the later stages of labor for production of milk, not expression of milk. We'll talk about that in a minute. Thyroid stimulating hormone is again released under the direction of thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and its target organ is the thyroid gland, and it's going to cause the release of two thyroid hormones that we'll talk about in the next hour. We've already mentioned adrenocorticotropic hormone, stimulating cells of the cortex of the adrenal gland, the outer portion of the adrenal gland, to release a hormone called cortisol. That's why it's a tropic hormone. It causes release of another hormone. And then these two hormones affect the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes in ways we just talked about. Those are examples of the anterior pituitary gland hormones, what they do and what stimulates them. And we'll talk about what goes on at the target organs for the tropic hormones a little bit later. The posterior pituitary gland only produces two hormones. Those two hormones are antidiuretic hormone, which used to be called vasopressin, and oxytocin. These are peptide hormones. They're very, very small hormones. They're made up of only a few amino acids, and you can see they're very similar. There's only a couple of different changes. There's a change in these two amino acids, a change in these two amino acids. Otherwise, these are almost essentially the same, but they function differently. Antidiuretic hormone, we've already talked about, acts on the collecting ducts of the kidneys. Oxytocin acts on smooth muscle and the cells of the breast as part of the letdown response to nursing. Again, the posterior pituitary gland hormones are actually produced in the hypothalamus. They're transported down through the infundibular stalk through processes of those cells that made them, and then they're released very similar to a neurotransmitter in a neuron into the capillaries of the posterior pituitary gland, where they enter the bloodstream and go to their target organs. Antidiuretic hormone, as we talked about, is produced in response to relative dehydration, and when it is produced, it floats through the bloodstream, where it binds to its receptors on the cells of the collecting duct of the kidneys, and when it binds, it activates the second messenger that inserts the aquaphor water protein transport proteins into the membrane, allowing water to be reabsorbed, and when the water is reabsorbed, you basically produce a urine that is more concentrated and less in volume, which is you're retaining that water, which is what you wanted to do because it was produced because you were dehydrated. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is basically, again, a small peptide hormone that has receptors on smooth muscle cells, primarily smooth muscle cells of the myometrium or the uterus. And basically, when oxytocin binds to those cells, it activates multiple different things. But what we're interested in here is it basically opens up calcium channels, and then calcium can come from outside the cell into the cell. This is a smooth muscle cell. If you remember back last semester, we said that smooth muscle cells work differently than skeletal muscle, that the calcium inside the cell binds to a calcium binding protein called calmodulin to form a complex that then stimulates actin-myosin interactions and ultimately contraction of that smooth muscle, which leads to the development of labor. So when a woman goes into labor, what happens is near the later stages of pregnancy, the smooth muscle cells of the myometrium will actually produce more of these oxytocin receptors. Oxytocin then increases in amount, binding to those receptors, causing the contraction of those smooth muscle cells in a rhythmic contraction that allows for the development of labor contractions and ultimately the delivery of the child. Oxytocin also is associated with the letdown reflex. It also has receptors in what are called myoepithelial cells associated with the breast tissue. Oxytocin causes contraction of those cells to cause the expression of the milk. So milk production is under the direction of prolactin, but milk expression, when the baby suckles the breast and stimulates oxytocin release, which then causes contraction of those myoepithelial cells and the quote letdown response and the production of milk from the breast at that time. That ends the first part of this lecture on the endocrine system. Please be sure to watch part 2 for the rest of this lecture.